So I thought it might be a good idea to show my face also, that way I can elaborate on some of these things. Um, so I have my little photo booth pulled up so that the camera is showing and you can see my face. So the standard that I chose for my lesson for doing um, fourth grade science in relation to the earth and space um, is the standard 4.3 E.3, which is that the student will demonstrate an understanding of locations, movements, and patterns of stars and objects in the solar system. And the particular objective that I chose works with how students can explain how the sun appears to move throughout the day um, by looking and observing by looking at and observing shadows. So I have a little picture underneath that. When I was doing my research, I realized that the website that I go to for our South Carolina alternative assessment has standards, and I thought that those were the alternative standards that I had sent you an email about, but it turns out that those are the regular state standards. So I did a little bit further digging, and I found it was a guide of different ideas of ways that students can show their understanding based on a more complex to a least complex scale. And so I don't know if you can see down here, if I can zoom in. Oh, it's not going to let me. I guess it will. Oh my goodness, too far. So down here it says the most complex would be that if a student uses models to identify the time of the day by the length of the shadows, and use illustrations to identify the sun's locations and if they're long or short. The middle ground is that a student can recognize that a length of a shadow changes during the day, and then the least complex being that a student can recognize a shadow. So I think for my particular students, I think that they could probably all recognize a shadow. So I would probably focus on this middle ground, being that they could recognize that a shadow changes during the day. So to do that, I decided that to engage, what I would first do would be to take students out on a sunny day, or even just when we go out for recess, and talk about what our shadows are. Have them by having them like play and notice that as they move and make different poses and spin around or whatever, that their shadow moves with them. And this would be to establish the visualization with the word shadow, so that they would know what the shadow is. And then I would come back into the classroom and I would start the lesson by saying, well, now we know what a shadow is. Do you think that shadows can change? Does the way that your shadow looks change? So then what I would do is the next day, first thing in the morning, I would have my students come with me outside. We have a sidewalk right outside our classroom that leads to our playground. And we would place a stationary object on the ground in direct sunlight, and we would check it maybe every hour, every 2 hours. And I would, with the students or with my assistants, we would have the students each time we'd go out, a different student would trace the outline of the shadow. And then we would write the time beside it so that way we could look at it, because my students, some of them can tell time, especially if it's a digital clock, but they understand that time is different. So they know, like, if I say, oh, it's 8 o'clock, we have to do it at 9 o'clock, they can understand that. So then what I would do was, during that day, as we're doing all of that, I would revisit what we've already learned about how the earth rotates, and how as the earth spins, it changes the way that the sun looks in the sky. And I also have already talked with my students about how the sun gives us light. The sun gives us sunlight. So that would be my explanation. And then to elaborate, I would play a game or do different activities with the kids using a flashlight, and I would make the room dark, and I would have them use different materials to show that objects that are see-through do not have shadows, and objects that you cannot see through do. I probably would mention the vocabulary of transparent, translucent, and opaque, but I would probably just narrow it down to saying you can see through it or you cannot see through it. And then talking about how light can go through it, but if it's solid or you can't see through it, then light doesn't go through it. And it would cast a shadow. And then for evaluate, I said I would have the students complete a reflection sheet that I would make that has visual responses. So my students, since they cannot write, what we usually do a lot of the times is, of course, we read questions to them, but they would have pictures, picture symbols associated with different things. So, for example, I think I put one of the first questions I would ask would say, well, where does sunlight come from? And then I might have different pictures like Earth, Sun, Moon, because we've gone over those things, and say, well, where does sunlight come from? And then I would have the next one that says, we see shadows when an object, and I would say, is see-through or is not see-through, or something to that effect. I haven't figured out how I would word that best for them to understand. And then another question I would ask would just be, do shadows change? And it would be like a thumbs up yes or a thumbs down no. So then, let's see, some of my strengths of my lesson idea. I think that my engage, explore, and elaborate parts are pretty solid, especially for my students. I think that my explanation and my evaluation could use some work, especially the explanation. I am struggling to figure out how to simplify some of the terminology and concepts that are associated with shadows, being that my kids do understand that the sun changes throughout the day. We talked about day and night, and how we see the sun in the morning, and then it's at a different place during the day, and then it sets at night. And so they understand that, but I think that, the understanding of that as the sun changes, the shadow changes, they would get, but not that it's the opposite side, if that makes sense. Because as I was doing some research into different activities that I could use for this, a lot of the activities focused around saying that, for example, at 9 o'clock in the morning, because the sun is in the east, the shadow is going to be further in the west. And then at noon, you're going to have a short shadow because it's high in the sky. And then, of course, reverse, where if it's 6 or 7 o'clock in the afternoon, that your shadow is going to be stretching out towards the east because the sun's in the west. So I think that would be a little bit too confusing. So I'm still trying to figure out how I could explain that better. Would be my weaknesses. And I will show you some of the resources that I found that I thought would be helpful for my students. So I found 3 different videos that I actually liked, and they all basically talk about the same thing. Of course, Crash Course Kids goes a little bit further in depth, but I do like that she does a mock, I guess you could say like a mock experiment, kind of like what we would do in my classroom, where she shows a light pole and how the sun changes over time and how the shadow would change over time. But again, since it goes a little bit further in depth, that's one of those times when it talks about the times of the day and the shadow being in different directions during the day. I liked that this video, the Kids Academy video, has an explanation of translucent, transparent, and opaque, and it shows those differences um, using objects with the flashlight, kind of, and that's where I got the idea to use that in my, particularly in the elaborate portion. So that would be a good video to use for that, to talk about how light passes through different things depending if you can see through them or not. And they talk a little bit further about that in the Peekaboo Dr. Bannock show. I watch this. We watch these videos a lot in my classroom for science. And my kids, even though he has a bit of an accent and it's hard to understand, my kids really like these videos and do pretty well with them. But I found those videos, and then I also found this unit, which while I'm here, we'll go ahead and just add that because I forgot to do that. But it seems to be pretty appropriate for my students, and I can, of course, adapt different things. But just to show you, it talks about, of course, transparent, translucent, and opaque, and I think that my students would understand that. But I really like some of the different activities included, which is that, where is it? Oh, I'm sorry, let me scroll all the way back up. I didn't realize I was further down. So it talks about light is, can, and has, and we do a lot of those as anchor charts in my classroom, as well as here's an anchor chart for opaque, translucent, and transparent in our KWL chart. But I saw this and I thought that this was pretty cool to talk about natural light and artificial light as being light that that just naturally happens, and artificial being things that are created by man, so flashlights and candles, things like that. But I see the candle on there and I'm thinking that's not necessarily true because it's fire. So that maybe I need to do a little bit further research into that. But that I thought that my students would do pretty well with. Well, I guess fire is man-made, so yeah, that would be true. And then of course it goes into day and night and talking about things that you see at nighttime, things you see during the day, and different times of the day. But it just has a lot of resources in it that I think I could use with my students. And I'm not sure if you can see all the way down here, but there's a light pass, or will it pass the light test? So that could be something that I could use as an extension activity when I am doing the elaboration portion. So I think I have a pretty good idea of some different things that I can use for my particular lesson with my students. But I do wonder if I might get some help trying to figure out how would be the best way for me to do the explanation part.